Hey guys, Digital Lifestyle here, back with another video. Right, this one's slightly controversial, and you may or may not like what you're going to hear. But this guy is saying some truth, especially when it comes to the funding of what's going on in a certain country in Europe, when it comes to arms, etc., etc. The people that are suffering in these countries, the price increase in oil, gas, food, etc., etc., is all attributed to what's going on in Europe right now. And unfortunately, the USA is printing money to fund this. And I hope this inspires people to wake up, to seek for peace, because this is what we need. We don't need this transhumanism agenda that they have for us. And a part of what's going on now is using this thing that's going on in Europe. And you get censored for saying certain words, so I'm not going to say it, but it's up there on the screen. This is ridiculous what's going on. Absolutely ridiculous. We do need a peaceful resolution. And this guy is speaking truth. He's speaking about history. He's speaking about what happened for this to happen in the first place, because the truth has not been told. And if you only knew the truth, you guys and those who are supporting this would not want it to happen. You would stop this now. This is the thing. Anyway, let's play what he has to say.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise in opposition to this resolution in the strongest terms possible as a piece of war propaganda that I will not have my name or my vote attached to. This resolution on the war in Ukraine is riddled with half-truths, historical omissions, and dangerous conclusions that urge our nation down the path towards a potential global nuclear war, the likes of which no one alive or dead on this earth has ever seen, and one that humanity will never experience twice. Rather than urging peace talks to bring an end to this dangerous border dispute halfway across the world, this resolution presents a simplistic narrative with no grounding in the realities of foreign policy or the history of Eastern Europe since the end of the Cold War, in order to justify a continued blank check, now over $100 billion, much of it totally unaccounted for, from the pockets of U.S. taxpayers to the Ukrainian government, in an undeclared proxy war with no exit strategy, and in which continued escalation endangers the entire world.
When he says the US economy, the US taxpayers are paying for this, it's not just the US taxpayers are paying for this. It's all those countries that are involved with a certain three-letter organization. It begins with N and it ends with O, and you can fill in the blanks. It has an A and a T in it. And that particular organization is more of a war propagandist organization, fueled and funded by the US and its allies. Those who are in bed with this particular organization are also trying to do exactly the same thing that's happened with Niger right now. Niger is having an issue with wanted to be free from France, and I played you video or I have shown you videos over a couple of days or a few days back regarding this issue with why they need to have their freedom. They need to have their commodities and their wealth transferred or paid for what it's worth, not enslaved and not sold off on the cheap, and the government gets kicked back and people still stay poor. This is wrong. And we're seeing another thing with this stupid, senseless act, not perpetrated by one but perpetrated by both, because this guy says it best.
Passing this resolution, adding the voice of the main Senate to this fool's errand, would be grossly irresponsible. I will readily admit that when I was a young man, I was fooled once by war propaganda. But to quote the president who fooled me, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, You aren't going to fool me twice. After learning the lessons of the disastrous Middle East wars, I resolved to follow the advice of another president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who served as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces during World War II. In his farewell address to Congress, he told America to beware the military-industrial complex. It is also worth remembering the words of Major General Smedley Butler, a very decorated Marine and veteran of World War I, who simply put it, war is a racket. So whenever the bipartisan war machine, the uniparty in Washington, urges our country into foreign wars, it is the responsibility of all citizens, especially lawmakers and bodies like these, to maintain cool heads and ask basic questions. So let's begin with a basic question about one of the claims in this resolution, seemingly parroting a repeated line in the corporate press, which is funded with advertising dollars from weapons manufacturers, that the Russian invasion in Ukraine was unprovoked. Madam President, there are many justifiable adjectives to describe this war: bloody, vicious, murderous, tyrannical, evil, illegal. I would accept any of these, but I will not sign my name to a lie. The claim this invasion was unprovoked can only be uttered sincerely if history began the day Russian troops crossed the border. In truth, there's been a long line of provocations, many made by Washington officials supposedly accountable to the American people, bringing us to this crisis point.
And what he's talking about here is in 2014, Donbass was bombed heavily by and attacked by the Ukrainians. And what Russia asked for was for a cessation to it. They asked for peace. They went to various bodies, including NATO and all these kind of people, and they signed a peace treaty. But that treaty was never enacted. What happened then was they funded, i.e. the country they're funding now, and I guess I made a mistake when I said to them. But hey, it's what it is. But you know what? If I get a strike, I get a strike. I don't care. At the moment, right, we need to understand that this has to stop. This whole thing is ridiculous, and it's only driving us into a position of a very, very negative downfall if it continues. You know, one country has to protect its rights, and the other one is defended. But if people actually dig deeper and understand what's happening within one region where you have the claim of people wearing swastikas and stuff like that, and the other nation is trying to defeat that, and you're having stories come out about, you know, one country, i.e. the one with you, is involved in chemical manufacturing or bioweapons technology and all that kind of stuff, and also US presidents involved in this, and all the scandals that are coming out. Come on, people need to wake up, you know. And he is saying it right. It is a lie. It's a major lie. We've been sold a lie, and taxpayers of all countries are paying for this heavily.
To be clear, provocation does not justify an action. A man may violently stab another who shoved him first. That stabbing would be wrong, just as this invasion is wrong. But it would also be false to say it was unprovoked. This word is used to absolve Washington war hawks of the numerous acts of incompetence and malevolence in the decades of buildup to this conflict since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And if we do not acknowledge the actions of our own foreign policy elites in our own federal government that have contributed to this war, then we have no hope in prescribing a proper course of action to bring about a peaceful resolution. Throughout the Cold War, the number one American foreign policy goal with regards to the Soviet Union was to keep nuclear weapons at bay. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet government dissolved, the nuclear arsenals remained, and so did the American interest in avoiding conflict that could bring about the end of the world as we know it. That's why there were agreements in those early days of the new era that Russia would not contest the reunification of Germany and its admittance into NATO. In exchange, American officials committed in writing that NATO would not extend, quote, 1 inch east beyond the German border. That agreement was promptly violated in the 1990s under President Clinton against the explicit warnings of American foreign policy experts who cautioned Russia would fear and react to these violations as nakedly hostile attempts to surround them militarily. And every American president since, Republicans and Democrats both, this is a bipartisan problem, has continued this manifest destiny policy of eastward NATO expansion towards the Russian border, disregarding the consistent warnings from both U.S. foreign policy realists and repeated red lines from the Russians that this is viewed as an existential threat to their national security. Some say NATO is a defensive alliance, so what does Russia have to worry about? I would ask them to tell that to Muammar Gaddafi, the former leader of Libya. His government invaded no other nation, and yet his life ended as he was sodomized to death in the streets after a NATO-led regime change war in his country. Is that what a defensive military alliance does? And for what purpose? Certainly no humanitarian outcome. The people of Libya now find themselves subject to open-air slave markets today in the 21st century. There is no excuse for invading a sovereign country. This is the principle readily proclaimed in this present foreign crisis, and one with which I heartily agree. But it is odd to hear this principle now often repeated in Washington by the very war hawks who I've watched since I was 12 years old, lying the American people into wars with invented pretexts to justify the invasion and occupation of sovereign Middle East countries for decades on end, paid for with the blood of our soldiers and the treasure of our taxpayers. And I wonder, Madam President, how we would feel as Americans if our roles were reversed. For a moment, I would ask this chamber to imagine a mirror reality, one in which the Russians won the Cold War and the Warsaw Pact was inducting Canada into its membership, putting their military on our border just north of Aroostook County. Would we shrug our shoulders and rest assured that the Warsaw Pact is only a defensive military alliance? Would we tell ourselves there was nothing to worry about after watching the Soviet Union, as the world's last empire and superpower left standing, spend the last 2 decades on regime change wars across the Middle East with death tolls nearing 1 million?
This is the thing with America. It is a hegemonic war-mongering country, and it has gone around the world, putting its bases in its armies and constructing and total devastation of countries, all in the name of taking those countries' commodities. Unfortunately, this has really come to a crescendo where those nations are saying, no, we've had enough, and they want them out. It's not just America they want out. They want the French out. They in all these countries that have been occupied or colonialized over commodities or whatever they have, whether it be gold, silver, whatever it is that they have, oil, it doesn't matter. These countries are now saying, you know what, we've had enough. We want you out. We want our own sovereignty. We've had enough of wars. And with regards to what's going on in Europe, that's absolutely ridiculous. It has to stop, because we can't continue to have countries that want to, supply with oil and cheaper goods be overtaken by countries like the hegemonic USA that wants to supply at a higher and a pricier, higher price. And making the people who are poorer suffer, wiping out people, making people die as a result, because people will die as a result of not being able to heat their homes and all that kind of stuff, and also wiping out the middle class at the same time, because the middle class are right now suffering. They're suffering as a result of what they've done to the pipeline with Russia. Cutting off the supply of natural gas to Europe has messed up. Europe 100%. Germany is in decline, as are we in the UK, as it's the whole of Europe. They're scrambling for new ideas. They're scrambling to find out how they're going to survive this winter. Whether we're going to have blackouts or not, we don't know. I don't know. It's down the track. It's beggars belief why central planners and people like that don't think of the consequences, or if they do think of the consequences and know the consequences, don't care.
As their military alliance snaked its way through Central America toward our southern border, with the KGB running intelligence operations to manipulate election outcomes and overthrow uncooperative leaders, would we not demand our leaders do something to protect our country from the threat encircling us? And if our economy and our military were a shadow of their former glory, and all we had left was a nuclear arsenal to tell Russia not to mess with us, how far would America be pushed before twitchy fingers were on the button?
True. No true word said. Listen, this is exactly how America behaves. It behaves in that way. If you go on to there, if you try to put some base next to there or whatever it is, they are going to react. And so why shouldn't others who fear this react? This is exactly why I say hegemonic. This is exactly why I say this has to stop. Because you cannot be the police of the world and expect people to respect you when you abuse your power, like having sanctions, crossing borders where you shouldn't be, surrounding countries with bases that are basically threatening them to annihilate the governments, not just the governments, and the population of those people, and steal their resources, because that's been going on for decades.
In truth, we don't have to imagine too hard how our country would respond to a Russian military threat on our border, because we know how America did respond during the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy considered Russian missiles off our coast a provocation, and he took action to secure our country, just as any national leader responsible to their people would when an antagonistic military force is approaching their border. Only fools would put a country with a nuclear arsenal in that position, cornered, fearful, and desperate, and then reject all offers to negotiate. Thankfully, Kennedy used diplomacy to diffuse the danger of that situation, a skill our leaders in Washington today seem unwilling or unable to exercise. Both Presidents Kennedy and Reagan, adamant Cold Warriors both, none would be accused of being friends to the Russians, always maintained open communication with the leaders of Russia to avoid escalation into nuclear conflict. Instead, our present-day leaders refuse diplomacy and push the war forward to the last Ukrainian standing, not for the benefit of the people of Ukraine, but to bleed the Russians dry, as in Afghanistan throughout the 1980s.
And people don't realize that 10 to 1, 450,000 Ukrainians have died compared to Russians who are involved in this. So, he's stating facts.
This posture isn't for the Ukrainian people. This isn't for the American people. This is for the empire that now stands in the place of our once proud republic on a mountain of corpses to maintain global hegemony. That's why in 2014, then Vice President Joe Biden oversaw the overthrow of the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. His crime was not signing a trade deal with the European Union. In actuality, he wanted to sign 2 trade deals with both Russia and the West. But when the EU agreement suddenly prohibited any economic agreement with Russia, Yanukovych says he felt like a bride who showed up for a wedding only to discover a never-before-discussed prenuptial agreement, and he just wasn't in the mood anymore. For that, he was regime changed. And if you doubt Washington, D.C. had anything to do with it, I have a bridge to sell you in Libya. Thanks to leaked phone calls, we know for a fact that the current Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, personally handpicked the leaders of the new government to replace Yanukovych. You can hear the phone call in her own voice as she speaks with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine about who is in and who is out in the new Ukrainian regime to make the whole thing stick. Is this what democracy looks like? I don't think so. And after the coup, The new government, urged on by local neo-Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion, and when I say neo-Nazi groups, I don't mean in the parlance that's often thrown around today. I mean actual Adolf Hitler-loving neo-Nazis who welcomed the German invasion during World War II. They urged the government and succeeded in banning the speaking of Russian and launching an ethnic cleansing campaign in the eastern regions of Ukraine. Russia responded, yes, by annexing the Crimean Peninsula to maintain control of the Sevastopol naval base, Russia's only warm water port with access to the Black Sea, which is a sort of Russian Alamo after many died defending it against German invasion in World War II. Whatever we think of that, it is of such strategic and nationalistic importance to the Russians. We better be prepared for nuclear war if we want them to give that up, because they're not going to give that up. But at the same time, he rejected petitions from ethnically Russian people in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, now at the center of the war, who wanted to secede and join Russia. But over the next 8 years, a civil war raged in these separatist regions. Our own government funneled weapons into the conflict. In 2016, I represented Maine on the National Platform Committee of my political party, along with our colleague, Senator Guerin of Penobscot County. At the time, I was shocked to read calls for sending these weapons into this civil war halfway across the world. That's why I opposed that language and fought to strike it from the document, warning that these policies could escalate into a nuclear conflict. And 7 years later, here we are, living under the shadow of it all. These are only some of the most significant provocations. NATO expansion, deposing a democratically elected government, funneling weapons into a civil war on Russia's border. I haven't even mentioned the torn up nuclear treaties and the years of domestic anti-Russian propaganda pushed onto the American people through an unholy alliance between U.S. intelligence agencies and the corporate press. Do you all remember that report that Vladimir Putin was putting bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan? That story was as false as the reports of Iraqi soldiers ripping Kuwaiti babies from incubators in the lead up to Desert Storm. Pure war propaganda. It was completely debunked. This disinformation was planted in the media by, quote, anonymous intelligence officials in the lead up to a major U.S. election. But if you ever read a retraction, you were lucky to find it on page 36 after months of front page coverage. That's how war propaganda works with the war machine. Lie, rinse, repeat, and never apologize. And let me preempt the accusations that I know will be coming likely outside this chamber, because I would never suggest that anyone in this chamber would make such accusations. But let me preempt it by stating clearly that Vladimir Putin, like so many governmental leaders across the world, is a tyrant. As a lover of liberty, he could be strung up like Saddam Hussein, and I wouldn't shed a tear. There's plenty of blood on his hands, and I'm sure that the day he meets his maker, there will be a lot to account for. So it is not for the sake of any despot that I oppose this resolution, but for love of our country and the wisdom of early leaders like George Washington and John Quincy Adams, who warned our country against entangling alliances, being...
I'm going to push back on when he says Vladimir Putin is a tyrant. Look, right? Isn't Biden a tyrant right now? Hasn't there been US tyrants? Haven't there been UK tyrants? Haven't there been French tyrants? So coming to that biased speech on Putin is wrong, because there are tyrants across the world. It doesn't matter what country they are in, whether it be black, white, indifferent. It doesn't matter. You have tyrants. As above, so below. Is what I'm trying to say here. You're going to have tyrants in any different guise, any different country, any different place. They will be tyrants. It has to be that way. This is how the world works. So don't say that he is a tyrant and he should be killed or whatever it is, because you can then say the same thing for Biden, Blair and all those other people. Would we want to see that? No, we don't. I personally do not like the idea of violence. I prefer dialogue. I would prefer us to have a country where people can actually speak, talk and enjoy and have debates that are honest and not biased. I agree with some of these points, but not all.
Being drawn into European power struggles and going abroad in search of monsters to destroy. and for the love of all the people caught up in this war, for the conscripted and enslaved men of Ukraine and Russia pitted against each other to the death for the benefit of oligarchs, for the many dead and displaced civilians, for those starving across the world from the consequences of a war in the Ukrainian breadbasket, for those in Europe, America, and here in Maine, freezing this winter due to natural gas shortages, and for everyone alive today and generations yet unborn who face the very real threat of nuclear annihilation, we must demand immediate diplomacy to end this war. Yet we see no diplomacy from Washington. In the rattling of their sabers for war with Russia, the Uniparty claims it is love of democracy and hatred of tyrants that drives them. So where are these affections as they partner with Saudi princes to genocide the people of Yemen? What makes the Yemeni people less worthy of our concern? Is their skin the wrong color? Are their lives of less value because they live in the wrong part of the world? Or is Washington simply so addicted to Saudi oil and the petrodollar that props up our paper currency that the deaths of 250,000 people is worth the cost? Madam President, it seems George Orwell predicted the state we find ourselves in. If you listen to the talking heads on the television screens, it would seem we've always been at war with Eurasia. But if you go searching down the memory hole for scraps of what was and possibilities of what could have been, you will find stories about the days when George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin toured Texas high schools together after the Russian president's call of support following the 9/11 Twin Tower attacks. You will find stories about Secretary of State Hillary Clinton hitting a reset button on U.S.-Russian relations for a new era of peace. So when did all this change? It is certainly not just that Vladimir Putin is a tyrant. As I've established, our leaders in Washington are fond of many tyrants around the world. The public pivot seems to have taken place when Russia stood opposed to the invasions of Iraq, Libya, and Syria, all grossly unconstitutional wars by our own American standards and waged for no clear American purpose beyond the profits of that institution Eisenhower warned us of. When Russia blocked the dreams of regime change in Syria, this appears to have been the last straw, and we've seen nothing but provocation and heard only drumbeats for war ever since. Madam President, the stakes on this matter are higher than any war in my admittedly short life of 34 years. Unlike Iraq, the nuclear weapons are not the imagined fantasies of war profiteers. The arsenals are real. Continued escalation is toying with nuclear fire, which could set the world ablaze. Today, we are fortunate to be alive to be able to look back at Iraq and admit mistakes were made. But 20 years from now, will we be so able under the clouds of nuclear winter? Even should the nukes stay put.
Oh, well, that's ended, unfortunately. Clearly there's a glitch in the system, but that's nothing to do with me. But I do like what he had to say on his speech. Some of it, most of it I would agree with. Some of it I do have issues with. But listen, you know, we are possibly on the brink of some, but then there are positives. You have to look at the change in the financial infrastructure, what's taking place. Could this whole war be a distraction? Or whatever. I do not know. I cannot tell you so. All I can say to you is, one, you may want to look at having some preparations, if you will, food storage. Do you know what I mean? A little bit of extra food somewhere. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. Not financial advice, not advice at all. I don't know. I do not know. But at the end of the day, yeah, we're moving in. The world is transitioning. War always predicates an awful lot of change, whether it be good or bad. It's up to you whether you want it to be good. You need to make that for yourself, that choice for yourself. Either prepare, get into the new world of digital assets, or stay on the sidelines. That's all I have to say. Anyway, do check Lifestyle out. Have a great day. Like and subscribe. If you don't, well, whatever. I can't make people do what they don't want to do. Anyway, take care. Bye.